Did the administration foresee the fall of Assad?
We didn't directly see the fall of Assad, but we certainly saw that his regime was incredibly weak. We saw, look, that's what I said a minute ago. We have been very clear going back to 2014 that the path forward was through the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And the most relevant portion of that Security Council resolution for this question is for Assad to do something to engage with his own public, his own people, about a political path forward. And we saw him do nothing. We saw him not only do nothing, but to continue to brutally oppress his people. And so when you have a dictator who engages in that type of behavior, their regime is going to be weak. It's going to be brittle. And that's true not just for Assad, it is true for other authoritarian regimes around the world. And so you take that and you combine it with the weakening of Russia's military capabilities and the weakening of Iran's military capabilities and Hezbollah's military capabilities, ultimately, which we played a part in, that gets you to where we are today. But now, it's not to say we foresaw the launch of an offensive 10 or so days ago, but we certainly saw how weak the Assad regime was. And I will note, it was about a year ago or a year or so ago that we had a conversation in here about other countries in the region readmitting Syria to the Arab League. And what you heard me say at the time is the position of the United States is Assad has done none of the things that the international community collectively asked him to do. And every country has to make their own decisions about how to respond to that refusal on his part. But we, the United States, decided that we were not ready to restore relations with him as usual. We were not ready to lift the sanctions on him. We were not ready to lift the pressure on him because we had seen him take none of those steps. And I think it's the combination of his refusal to engage with his own public and the pressure that we and other countries around the world put on him that ultimately got us to where we are today.
I mean, I asked the question.
Sorry for the long-winded answer to the question.
But I asked the question because there has been, you hint to it there, a lot of the US administration in the last 24 hours who are taking the credit for its foreign policy decisions that, in part, created the conditions for this to happen in terms of the weakening of Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia. And therefore, there's a sort of, if you kind of break it, you own it, part of the foreign policy element, which is what now is both has been your planning for this eventuality, and therefore what leverage do you have, what influence do you have on the players now that are in control in Damascus? What can you say now that will influence them to do the kind of things you want them to do?
So I don't want to totally reject the premise of the question, Tom, because I do respect the question, but I do think that at a time like this, that really is the wrong way to look at the question. It is not a question of what leverage or influence the United States has, because ultimately, this is a process that needs to be led by Syrians, not by the United States, not by any other country in the region. And so what we can do is make clear that we will support the Syrian people on this path towards a better future. We're going to protect our own interests while we do that. We're going to make sure that ISIS doesn't reemerge. But it is not for the United States to try to use its influence or leverage to dictate any path forward for them. We want to see them make those decisions on their own. Now, we're going to be clear in engaging with all of the relevant parties inside Syria and elsewhere in the region that there are a few core fundamental principles that we want to see respected as that moves forward. But ultimately, that is these are decisions for the Syrian people to make, not for us.
But I mean, I'm just thinking, if you're HTS and you're thinking about the way ahead, and clearly, there is a direction you want them to take and one you don't want them to take. And so I'm asking about what you can do.
Yeah, fair question. Look, fair question. So there are sanctions that the United States has imposed on Syria. There are various forms of diplomatic relations that we hold with countries and that we suspend with others. All of those things are the tools that the United States has in its toolbox when it comes to responding to this situation. And so when I say that we will judge HTS by their actions and we will respond through our own policies, that is the kind of thing that I am talking about when I make that sort of statement, when the Secretary and the President make those sort of statements.
And just finally on that point, then, I mean, for Syrian people who've endured it's just utter brutality and under Assad and then the ravages of this civil war for many years now, and when they, I asked the question about what trust they should have in the US when it comes to this, because the moderate opposition groups, that they desperately wanted more US support for years. There was a funding program that was pulled. There was the chemical weapons being used by Assad, and people wanted to see American planes in the sky at some points during that. They didn't see them. They wanted air defenses against Russia's bombardment of Aleppo and hospitals and homes in parts of Syria. And there are people who feel abandoned. I feel the US didn't come to their aid at that point. So what can you say now to sort of
let me say that first of all, we stand with the Syrian people, and we have always stood with the Syrian people and stood against the brutal tyranny of Bashar Assad. Now, we have to make difficult decisions when it comes to direct military intervention, because we know that oftentimes the consequences of direct U.S. military intervention, either in the short term or the long term, outweigh the benefits that intervention can provide. And so those are the kinds of difficult decisions that we have to make. I know I stand in this briefing room all the time and am asked very hard questions about the result of the U.S. supplying weapons to parties in the Middle East. So they are difficult decisions that we have to make. But I will say, we have always stood by the Syrian people, and we have taken actions to hold Assad accountable and to put pressure on the regime. And it is those actions in combination with some of the other factors I've gone through today that ultimately led to the events of the past 48, 72 hours. Yeah, not easy.